I treat every bow that I get, whether it's a very, very inexpensive bow to the nicest bow, I treat every bow like a Sartori or some very nice bow. Because when you are working on the less expensive bows, if you treat it with that respect, when you do come across a nice bow like a Sartori, you'll be ready for that.
I had a great time chatting with today's guest, who I met in person for the first time earlier this year at the 2019 International Society of Bassists Convention. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are talking today with Brianna Goldberg, who has quickly become one of the most sought-after bow specialists in Southern California. And after several performance degrees and performing all over the country, she became inspired, and we talk about this, it's very cool, in part by a conversation with Sue Lipkins on this podcast, and inspired her to look into the world of bow rehairing and repair. So we talk about that. We talk about her backstory, the rewards of starting a small businesses and the challenges too. There's a lot. Getting her own physical retail location and just what that's like. And I pepper her with questions about bows at the end, probably like 20 questions of things that I'm always wondering about or people asked me. Brianna's doing amazing work. Definitely check her out. bgbows.com is her website, and she's on Facebook and Instagram. That's all linked up. Quick shout out before we get going here to our sponsors, D'Addario Strings, Steve Swan String Bass, Upton Bass, the Bass Violin Shop, Modacity, Colstein Music, A440 Violin Shop, and Encoda. That's Nkoda. More on them later, but here is our conversation with bowmaker, bow rehairer, bow repair person, Brianna Goldberg. Well, thanks for doing this.
Sure.
And I was thinking back to the last time I've only ever talked with somebody who works in bows once before. And
Yes.
It was Sue Lipkins, and it was like 400 episodes ago or something crazy like that.
Coincidentally, I think I mentioned to you, that was actually part of the reason why I started doing Rehairs, was because I listened to that episode and her story kind of resonated with me. And I had already had the idea a little bit beforehand, but that spurred me to go and look up where to learn to do Rehairs. And that's where I found, University of New Hampshire Violin Craftsmanship Institute. And I went out there and learned how to do Rehairs.
Wow. What a small world.
I know.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
Well, that was an interesting chat, just because I've played bows all my life, but I don't really know that much about them. Yeah. I was talking with an adult student that I have here in San Francisco, and he has like a carbon fiber, kind of entry level thing. And then I've got this Baron Doling bow. That's nice. They get nicer than that, but it's a nice bow. Yeah. And he was like, how much is that? I was like, it's maybe $4,000, $5,000. He's like, why is it so much more? And it's just, and I don't have a great answer for that, but I think of it kind of like the world of cameras. There's like there's like your phone camera, then there's like $1,000 camera, then there's like an $8,000 camera.
Sure.
Okay, so that's super cool that you got. So you heard Sue and you started thinking about that, and then you'd been thinking about bow rehairs possibly? Okay.
Initially, when I moved back to California and I started freelancing, I talked to some of my colleagues, mainly bass players, and I asked, who does your rehairs? And nobody had a really enthusiastic answer. And I thought, okay, there's a market there and there's a need for that. And I kind of filed that away. And then I heard Sue talk about her story, and I was also fascinated by all the steps that she gave in making a bow. That sounded really neat. And now I've listened to that again after having learned to make bows, and it takes on a whole different meaning now. And I have a whole different understanding of what she was talking about. But it was interesting to hear that at first, and then that inspired me to learn to do rehairs.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And I think that probably anybody listening to this anywhere in the world doesn't feel like they have an overabundance of people that do great bass rehairs, like that. Yeah. And some people, there are people that do rehairs, but I think we bass players, that my perception at least, we really like to go to somebody that understands basses, and that could be somebody that does all instruments, but a lot of the time there are people that are like dialed in. What is it about bass rehairs that are different than our upper string counterparts?
Well, in my shop, I primarily do bass rehairs, and I did work for about a year at Robert Cower's violin shop in Hollywood. So there was no bass rehairs. It was just violin, viola, cello. And I would find that I would use different techniques, slightly different techniques on bass rehairs with some of the fittings. For example, there's a part that's called the spreader wedge that spreads the hair. It's a little light-colored piece of wood right by the hair on the frog. And I do a slightly different shape there just to force the hair out into the corners. Sometimes it tends to come in a bit. And I wouldn't necessarily do that on a violin bow. It doesn't have that challenge that a bass bow does. And so I think people that don't do bass rehairs all the time, I think there are certain things that they can get out of practice with and just little nuances that really make a difference.
Okay. Now, so you're from Southern California.
I am, yes.
Okay.
From the Valley.
All right. Nice.
Yeah.
And was bass, did you start off on bass? Did you play something else first?
Yes, I started off on bass. I was put in a beginning strings class in middle school. I was supposed to be in a Spanish elective, but they messed up my schedule. So I was in a beginning strings class, and the teacher asked who wanted to play violin, viola, cello. Everyone raised their hand. She asked who wanted to play the bass, and nobody raised their hand, and I felt really bad for the teacher, and so I said, oh, I'll do it. And then I ended up liking it, and I mean, my Spanish has suffered, but, you know, that's the cost, so... But yeah.
And then you left California for school? Is it?
Yeah, I got pretty serious about bass in high school, and I went to New England Conservatory for my undergrad degree with Don Palma, and that was wonderful. After that, I was in Cincinnati for a couple years doing my master's with Al Laszlo at CCM, the College Conservatory of Music. And after that, I was in El Paso, Texas for a couple years. I got a job the Symphony there, was principal bass with the El Paso Symphony, and played there and actually taught in 2 elementary schools one of the years I was there, which I realize is not for me. And I was still taking auditions at the time, and I realized that most of the people who were winning auditions at that time all came from Indiana University, and I thought, maybe there's something special going on there. And so I went back to school and did performer diplomas at Indiana University with Bruce Bransby. So that was pretty wonderful.
Okay, well, that's a great journey. Okay, so I have like many follow-up questions.
Sure.
Okay, so first of all, I was obsessed with California as a Midwesterner, and I would whenever I get out here, I would just like look at a palm tree and I would think, if only I could have this, you know. And now I'm out here, I don't even notice them. I've so adjusted. But what was that experience? Had you spent a lot of time in places like Boston prior to moving there?
No, that was my first time.
Okay, what was that
snow?
First year? Yeah, snow, like the dark recesses of the Boston winter.
Exactly.
Like, what was that experience like?
Well, you know, every winter people there would say, oh, don't worry, this is the worst winter we've had in a long time. And they would say that every single winter. So it just kept getting worse. But, you know, at the time when I was in high school, the thing I was thinking was, oh, I need to get out of LA. You know, I need to get as far away from home as possible. So I went to the other side of the country, and it was a really different experience, a different kind of way of life out there. And, you know, I think it was interesting. A lot of, you know, wearing dark colors and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a big contrast. The corners of the country, I think like the contrast between LA and Boston, and then if you think of like Seattle and Miami, you know,
yes,
like
exactly.
It's like they're almost like different countries, different cultures, and
they really are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very, and I've spent a little time in El Paso, Texas, not much, a little. My wife's from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we would go down to southern New Mexico, and I think Cloudcroft, New Mexico is not too far from there.
Oh, yes.
It's really beautiful. But what a difference. So there, I think summer probably starts in El Paso, like in April or something like that. Isn't it like it's stupendously hot?
It is, but it's, you know, it's interesting because it's also high desert. So in the winter, they do get a little bit of snow, and they just for a little bit of dusting, they close the schools and everything. And they're not equipped to handle snow, but they do get a little bit of snow. Okay. But it is pretty warm there for the most part.
Okay. Yeah. So lots of bass schooling, and then you're studying with Bruce Bransby, and you're in Indiana and taking auditions this whole time?
Taking a lot of auditions.
Okay.
I kept track of them, and I took in all 24 auditions when I was doing that. And it's interesting because they were both bookended. My first audition and my last audition were both for New Mexico Symphony or Philharmonic or whatever it was called at the time. But, it was an interesting thing. And towards the end, it was when I moved back to California that I realized, this is starting to get expensive, taking all these auditions, especially living on the West Coast. You have to fly everywhere. It's not like Indiana where everything's within a day's drive. And I just thought for me, I wanted to kind of settle down and start my life. And I thought maybe I'm done with auditions at this point. So
my I'm done with auditions moment came auditioning for the Kansas City Symphony. I think I was over 24 auditions. I was probably like nearing 30. And I was playing a gig in Memphis, Tennessee. And I was pretty burned out on auditions. I had not prepared particularly well for this audition. And I thought, do I really want to stop off? Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't Kansas City. It was the St. Louis Symphony. So it was kind of back on the way to Chicago. And I thought, do I want to take this? But I wanted my deposit check back. So I thought, okay, I'm going to stop off in St. Louis. I'll audition, and I auditioned poorly, got my deposit check. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And so I decided to get off that crazy train. Myself.
I had a similar thing kind of happen in El Paso, where that summer it was after my master's. I was just taking every audition that came up that summer. There were 2 auditions that came up in Texas one day after the other. The first was in Austin and the second was in El Paso. And if you know anything about Texas geography, which I didn't at the time, those are pretty far apart.
Yeah.
And I drove out from LA, drove out to Austin, played a terrible audition at 5 p.m., drove through the night, had my next audition in El Paso at 10 a.m. And I was feeling pretty disheartened, like, why am I doing this? I just want to go home. And it ended up being successful for me at that point, but never again.
I know that feeling well. I had this crazy drive where I used to play in Memphis, and then I had to be in Milwaukee the next morning.
Oh my goodness!
And so I did the math. But they were my first 2 gigs out of my master's program, and I realized if I played both of those gigs, I could pay rent at least and probably eat. But they had, so it was a 8 p.m. concert in Memphis. I get done at 10 p.m., get in the car, still in my suit, and drive 700 miles through the night, and then have a double in Milwaukee, and then drive the hour 15 minutes back to Chicago. And I just remember, I think those took a few years off of my life. But I would do that in the winter, and so it would be like 33 degrees and raining in Memphis. And I thought, okay, this is not probably going to get better going north. But,
yeah, definitely.
So you're back in California, and by the way, I can totally relate. It seems kind of ridiculous in a way to someone who doesn't live in California, maybe feeling isolated in a place of 40 million people, but it's so different from living in Bloomington, Indiana, or Cincinnati, Ohio, where you could like draw a circle of a day's drive, and you've got like half the country's population. Like we've got LA, we've got San Francisco, and then we've got 1,000 miles almost to the next place.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. So true.
So you're gigging, and then when did had you ever thought about bows really before, besides playing them, or when did you start to think of that as something you might want to explore?
No, I hadn't really, but I've always liked working with my hands. I have a lot of hobbies where I work with my hands, and I thought, well, this might be something that I'd be interested in trying. And so, like I mentioned, I went to the University of New Hampshire Violin Craftsmanship Institute, which was when I looked up where to learn to rehear, that was the first place that popped up. Lynn Hannings and George Rubino both teach there, and that was fantastic. The first year I learned rehairing and basic repair, and I came back to start my shop in my dining room of my apartment, which I was in for a couple of years until I moved on to a commercial space. But I've gone back, to University of New Hampshire in subsequent summers. They also have a workshop out in Claremont, California, the Southern California Violin Makers Workshop. And both Lynn and George go out there to teach in alternating years. And so that one was a little bit closer to home as well. But Yeah, I did that.
It's an interesting world to me. I know so little about the bow making world. I know a little more about the bass luthier world because I've been at some various events, the Violin Society of America, and so. But how long is this program? It happens every year. Is it for a?
Happens every year, and there are different week courses that you can take in the different subjects. And so, I did bow rehear and basic repair. The next year, I went back and I think I did in total 3 weeks of frog and button making and a week of stick making and advanced bow repair. And there are just classes that you can kind of build on to, the next one. And they're really fantastic. And it's a really wonderful resource. I mean, Lynn and George are just, wonderful craftsmen and teachers as well. And this program with bow making has gone back to Bill Salco, who was both of their teachers. He taught there for a while, so it's has a pretty good history.
And are these people? Is this? Lynn Hanning's. I think of bass bows, but again, from my bass perspective, is this? Was what you're doing? Bows in general, or bass centric, or some combination, or is this workshop tailored towards people in the bass bow world, or just in bow repair and rehair in general, and bow making in general?
Bows in general. Okay. I chose to focus on bass bows just because that's more of what I know and what I'm interested in. And so they don't recommend making your first bow with a bass bow. So I started with a cello bow, but my second bow, I said, okay, now I'm making a bass bow.
Okay. I was talking with Trevor Davis. This is several years ago at this point, just about his journey into the bass luthier world, and he went to, like many people in that world, is it the School of Violin Making in Salt Lake City? I walked by that place, and just, he was talking about like the type of person that goes into that, and is who were you going to these classes, or when you go to events like this, what's sort of the path into bow making? Like, is it just all over the place, or like what kind of people are attracted to that? This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. When you pull the string through the peg, twist it around itself a few times before continuing to wind. This pulls more of the string through the peg neatly, and it decreases the likelihood of the string falling out of tension. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. There is this mode in my practicing app, Modacity, which I totally love. It's called Deliberate Practice, and it's such a cool feature. Here's Modacity founder and CEO Mark Gelfo on how this works.
One of my pain points as a musician was not really having a method to generate reliable improvement. And deliberate practice is like the scientific method for music practice. So what you do is you identify the one thing that you want to improve, be it articulation, intonation, emotion, comfort, whatever it is you want to improve, and brainstorm or choose one of the pre-suggested strategies for that area of improvement, and then test it out. Record yourself trying that strategy, listen back, and press yes, it worked, or no, it didn't work, to create that improvement.
It's such a clean way of tracking your progress. I do it every day, and it has done wonders for my bass playing and just my overall enthusiasm for music. You got to check it out. Modacity.co is the site, and if you go to our site, you can click through it and get a special offer for lifetime access for this app. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. Upton Bass is at a fascinating transition from selling accessories online, kind of in the early days, to selling other people's basses, to starting to make their own basses, which they now do and make over 120 a year. Here are Eric and Gary of Upton Bass on that transition.
So then we stopped getting containers of instruments,
right? Yeah,
which was
a lot of dough all at once. So it was taxing, and the quality was going down with every shipment, And at that point, we were doing so much ourselves, anyways. Final assembly, varnish, setup. It was kind of a no-brainer to start making them in-house.
Whatever your playing needs are, Upton Bass will find you an instrument that works with your budget and that you will love for the long term. They have an amazing, loyal fan base that has bought, several people have bought 2, 3, even 4 Upton Basses over the years. They stand behind their products. They're beautiful instruments made in the Northeast in the United States. UptonBass.com, and thanks so much for sponsoring the podcast.
You know, I find it is kind of all over the place. There are a lot of musicians that go into it, but in some of these classes, there were people that had never played an instrument before, and I thought, oh, that's so strange that they'd be interested, they'd even know about something like that. But I think the type of person that it's really well suited for is somebody who's very detail-oriented, who likes working by themselves. I went to a convention, the Violin Society of America, in Cleveland last year, and it was a lot of violin and bowmakers, and it was interesting because there was a lot of people that were used to just working by themselves, and then we had to interact. And so it was
sounds like a podcaster convention.
Yeah.
It's very similar. Well, I was at that event in Cleveland. Actually, we must have missed each other. Yeah, I came out and I did spent some time with Arnold Schnitzer and some of the other makers. Lisa Gass, another fellow Southern Californian. Yeah. So, okay. Sorry, I've many, lots of things that I'd love to know more about.
Sure.
So, what were you doing? You were talking about hobbies and liking to work with your hands. What were some of those, or are some of those hobbies?
Well, I made a list recently because I have so many hobbies, and I thought, I think I have a ridiculous amount of hobbies. I have about 38 hobbies, and some of them include... I recently learned to make stained glass. I was doing something called kirigami, which is the art of cutting and folding paper, which actually it's very relaxing and really improved my rehair technique, believe it or not. Just caused me to slow down and focus more and be more detail oriented. But I crochet and I do reupholstery, all kinds of things.
Wow. Were you always like that, going back to a little kid?
I was, and it's funny because there was a time where I talked to a bass player that has been very successful in auditions, has a great job, and I was just making small talk, and I said, "Oh, what are your hobbies? What do you like to do?" And he said, "I really just like playing the bass." And I thought, I don't think I could ever do that. I couldn't give up all my hobbies just to just focus on bass solely, and so I think I'm just not that kind of person. But I have a lot of different interests.
Yeah, well, me too. No, I identify with that. I don't know if I have 38, but I always find it fascinating when someone only, it's like bass. What else do you like? Reading about bass,
Yeah.
and then another fellow Southern Californian that comes to mind is like Sue Wolf. If people don't know, she's San Diego Symphony assistant principal bass. And Sue, in addition to playing bass, dancing, working with her hands, like you were describing, building and refurbishing things and that sort of thing. Yeah, I think it's beautiful. For me, it get the creativity or just the modality shift, I guess, sort of seems to help with other things that I'm doing in life.
Sure. Yeah.
Wow.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've now you've got your own shop and you got this beautiful website, and I'll point people to that and on Facebook and everything, but maybe just take me or us on that path from your working in your kitchen or in your living room.
Sure.
And how does the bow making evolve, or bow rehair, repair, and then we can talk about making too.
Yeah.
But how'd that evolve?
Well, I just went home and started working in my dining room, set up a space with a workbench and a few small benchtop tools, machines. And I have a friend and kind of a mentor down in San Diego named Abe Liebhaber, who's a bow maker and a cellist down there. And I went and visited his shop, and I thought it was such a cool space. I thought, I kind of want something like this. And he told me that the best way to learn to do more advanced repairs on bows is to learn how to make a bow. Because if you can make a bow, you can fix most anything on a bow. And that's initially what got me into bow making. And then I realized, I kind of like this, and maybe I'd like to just make bows to make bows. But working out of my apartment, I think there was a certain amount of credibility that I had to earn with my work, because when people would show up at my apartment, especially if they didn't know me or if they were referred from someone that didn't tell them I was working out of my apartment, they'd say, well, I think I'm here. And then I'd lead them into my apartment, and then they'd relax a little bit when they saw my workbench and my tools and everything. But there was always just that kind of, that sort of, that credibility that I had to earn. And then once they saw my work, they could relax a bit. But I think having a storefront kind of gives me more of that credibility up front. And it's also nice to just have a much bigger space to work in. I think I gained like 500 square feet with my workshop.
Wow.
So, yeah. And so making bows in such a small space, and, you know, especially in my home, I mean, I was tracking sawdust into my sheets in my bed. I mean, it's like you go everywhere. So it's nice to have a separate space.
Yeah. For me, I love trying to separate that out. There are some tasks I can only do at home. Like I can't be at a co-working space right now doing what we're doing here. I mean, I can, but it would be socially unacceptable. But I love getting out of the house and trying to, and having your own dedicated space is a beautiful thing. And that credibility thing is so interesting because, like, I remember talking to Ralph Alcala, another, bringing up a lot of Southern Californians here, but Ralph, for those who don't know, he moved to Cleveland, Ohio for a little while to start doing repair work, luthier work. And he was telling me, and I think he had I don't know if he was working out of home. I think he had a space, but regardless, one thing for him is people would come over who hadn't met him, and he was young and he was like all covered in tattoos, and like that, like scared the, you know, like violin, you know, elementary school players and their moms off or something, or there was a little bit of that. And then I, you know, chatting with Mitch Mooring, who's somebody who's recently opened a retail location, very different place, Kilgore, Texas. But just, I think it's super exciting to see, younger luthiers, bowmakers, or instrument makers, or whatever, kind of, you know, getting that retail footprint, and that's very cool.
And I think I got very lucky when I started out, because I had a good network of people that I knew from playing bass, or, you know, from that world. And so, you know, a lot of my clients include people from basically like the whole LA Phil section, maybe minus one guy, Colorado Symphony, Atlanta Symphony, National Symphony, the Met Orchestra, a lot of studio bassists in LA, freelance bassists, and then college and conservatory students. And then younger students, high school and younger, I offer a discount to encourage them to get their bows rehaired, because I feel like sometimes the price would be prohibitive and they just wouldn't go and get a rehair ever. So
yeah, and it's easy to let it go, especially if you're young and you don't know what like a good rehair is or feels like. And and I love though you've got, you know, you've got a website, you've got the Facebook page, but I love how quality work sort of speaks for itself and is its own best marketing. You know, I think that most of those players we could safely say probably didn't find you just randomly searching around. It's the power of the word of mouth.
Exactly. And before I started, I had gotten together with my aunt, who has a background in marketing, and we made a marketing plan, and that was very helpful in starting a business, because I knew nothing about starting a business. But a lot of the things that we had talked about, I didn't really need to execute, because a lot of just word of mouth really did all the marketing that I needed.
Okay.
But it was good to get organized that way.
Well, I've got an interesting question for you. It's something I've thought a lot about with my, whatever it is I do. And then talking to Gael McCann, who's a luthier who moved to San Francisco in 2011 to coincide with the ISB convention here in San Francisco. And then he, based out of Berkeley, he recently moved to France, just change it up. Yeah. But he in a way became, this might seem like kind of a weird question, but I think it's something interesting. I don't know if you thought about it much, but so he almost became a victim of his own success is probably the wrong word, but he was all of a sudden like inundated with work, and like just trying to like balance that became a major challenge for him. Like, I don't know if you're at capacity in terms of bow, in terms of what you're doing, but have you thought about like how things scale for you?
Definitely. Okay. And it has been very tricky trying to manage my schedule and you know, schedule enough time so that, you know, I'm not just working all the time. Scheduling a day off has been, you know, a thing for me, where I've really tried to do that. But it's been interesting. I've been looking at different methods of scheduling. There's this app that I found that's interesting. It's like an online scheduling app, but I don't think it would work to have other people go in and do the schedule. So I just pretend that I'm them and I schedule everything that way. So I know that I plan enough time for myself to do the work. And sometimes that works out and sometimes not so well, but it's still a work in progress. And I've even thought about at some point hiring, an assistant to do, answering phones and bookkeeping and things like that. But just to free up time to really do all the rehairs and bow making.
Well, yeah, and again, it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem. And I ended up getting help for this podcast a while ago, and I can't imagine not having the help now, just because it's moving parts and it's a very different thing. But so let's say somebody's listening to this and they're thinking about possibly exploring bows, kind of like you were listening to that Sue Lipkins. Like, what are some of the most surprising things about getting into working with bows? What were things that, like, if you could give someone advice that was just about to think about, hey, I'm going to go check out some of those courses in New Hampshire, or I want to explore more, like, what do you wish you'd known? What are some things to look out for? What are some unexpected takeaways or that kind of thing?
Well, I think I've learned that I think rehairing came somewhat easily to me, but I am a very detail-oriented person. And I've realized that, just through some of my other classmates at some of the workshops, if you're very detail-oriented and you really are very careful with your work, because it is a very careful sort of thing. You don't want to be breaking any very valuable bows. But honestly, I mean, to that extent, I treat every bow that I get, whether it's a very, very inexpensive bow to the nicest bow, I treat every bow like a Sartori or some very nice bow. Because when you are working on the less expensive bows, if you treat it with that respect, when you do come across a nice bow like a Sartori, you'll be ready for that. One problem that I've noticed with bow making now is that Pernambuco is very hard to come by, because it's protected and you can't really import it into the country. So a lot of people here stockpile it and you have to buy what people have. So I've found some, reputable guys that have sold me Pernambuco, but it is very difficult, and building up a stock is interesting. People are doing a lot of good work with conservation, though. Like Lynn Hannings is doing this whole thing with I think it's called an International Alliance with instrument and bow makers to preserve Pernambuco, ebony, maple, and eventually spruce. She'd be a great person to talk to about conservation.
Yeah, we've talked about we'll make something happen at some point here. It's super interesting, and that I know that's a challenge that bass makers face too, or any instrument maker. But just the limited supplies, and wood like Pernambuco that has environmental challenges, political challenges. It's not easy.
Yeah, but I'd say really, once you learn how to actually work on bows or instruments at the workshops. For me, the most difficult thing was starting a business, and really the business side of things, because I had no experience with that. And there were a couple business role models that I had that were great. Like you had mentioned Lisa Gass, and I've known her since I was a little kid as a bass player. And I just remember a couple instances, seeing how she interacted with me as a customer and the quality of her work. I was just amazed by it. And so she's always been a role model for me in business. And now she doesn't work on bows, so she sends some people to me for rehairs. Another role model was Robert Cower, who I worked with at his violin shop. One of the most honest, fair businessmen that I've ever seen in this business. So knowledgeable. Another great resource was the SBDC, which is the Small Business Development Center. And this is something that's across the country. If you're starting a small business, I think it's government funded, so it's just free, and you can get all the free business advice you need. It's people that have already started small businesses, and they work there to give you advice. And they were very, very helpful in just the real basic business side of things. So that, I think, is very helpful in starting a business. That was the one thing the bows I could handle. The business stuff was like, oh, I don't know about that.
This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They recognize that traveling and flying with the bass can be a serious obstacle. That's why they now offer several options for the jet-setting bassist. Either rent their removable neck bass for a no-hassle, convenient way to take a bass in a small package, or convert your bass to a removable neck and never be without your companion for those important performances. Purchase their Lemur Music Liberty Bell Flyaway. This package includes an airline-friendly custom travel case, and in minutes you can disassemble the bass and you're ready to go. Contact them to chat about options and find the one that best fits you. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. One of the great bass players of all time, Fred Zimmerman, former principal bass of the New York Philharmonic. He was Barry Colstein of Colstein Music. He was Barry's bass teacher. Here's Barry on Fred Zimmerman.
Anybody that knew Fred would say he was one of a kind. I mean, the man was probably the most talented, the most giving. He was the most interesting. Not only was he an amazing teacher, an amazing performer, he was an amazing artist also. He was truly a great artist.
Along with Fred Zimmerman, people like Milt Hinton, Homer Mensch, Orrin O'Brien, and so many others have had their basses worked on at Colstein's or had instruments made for them by Colstein's. Thank you, Barry, for everything that you've done for the bass world. And folks, check them out at Colstein.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And Steve has been researching top regraduation for many years. Here's Steve on the topic.
I found some old diagrammed bass tops in an old violin making book that had violins, violas, cellos, and only 4 basses from kind of the classic period, the early 1800s. And I took a pattern of kind of a topographical map of thicker in the center under the bridge, and then the thinnest is right near the edges, just before it flares out and gets strong again. And I put in some measurements that I thought would work, and we use that as a general pattern for top regraduation, and it really works.
You would be amazed how well this technique works. I've been impressed time and time again at how immediately a bass speaks after coming from Steve's shop, and how resonant and beautiful and open the sound is. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. Well, it seems to be working great, and this space looks beautiful. And I've got a bunch of, if you don't mind, just kind of like random bow questions that
Sure.
are endlessly debated on internet forums and things. Okay, so I wrote some down, but a lot of these will just pop in my mind. Okay, how often should I get a rehair? Very broad question, but what do you think?
Well, when people come in to get rehairs, I give them a little card that says the date of their rehair, and then I write next rehair. I say maybe about 6 months from that date. So I say 6 months on average. Some people say, oh, that's way too late. I get rehairs every 4 months. Some people say, oh, I'll come in a year. So 6 months is around average, I would say, and I think that's a good amount of time to really keep your bow in good healthy shape to get checked up.
Okay, I love it. It's like going to the dentist.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've been talking about different climates. How about, and you're rehairing bows in Southern California, which is a different climate from, say, Cincinnati, Ohio, or Chicago, or whatever. How does the time of year, or where you're living, or the humidity level, how does that factor into that? And I ask that because I had this long series of, I would call them way too tight rehairs in Chicago, like from somebody who I won't mention, but I could never loosen it enough. Like I would loosen it, would still be like kind of quasi tight. And then I've had the opposite end where it's like, what the heck? Why can't I tight? Why am I like playing with on the stick? So
Sure.
how do regional climate differences go into the rehair of the process?
Humidity is one of the biggest things with the hair. With dry humidity or with dryness, the bow hair shrinks. And with more humid temperatures, the bow hair stretches. And so, just as an example, last week we had a lot of Santa Ana winds here, which brought in a lot of dryness, humidity in the single digits down here. And so rehairs I did during that time, when the humidity came back up, all the hair stretched out, and I was getting a few people saying, oh, my hair's, a little longer than I would like it now. And so I have a couple people coming in to get the hair shortened. So there's that sort of thing. Or maybe if somebody, in your case, if somebody rehaired the bow when it was more humid and then it dried out, sometimes the danger is that it would dry out enough that it would maybe cause some danger to the stick, cracking.
I've seen some bass rehairs where it feels like there's just like way too much hair on,
Yes.
and then somewhere it's like this perfect, like beautiful line. Is that just like someone who doesn't know what they're doing versus knows what they're doing, or are there different stylistic, or are people going for different things in rehairs? What am I seeing when I see those differences?
Well, I have heard that there have been studies done that show that more hair in a rehair actually dampens the sound. And so I have seen some people that put quite a bit of hair in, maybe twice the amount that I would normally put in. And when I put, a lesser amount that's a little bit more appropriate for the bow, it tends to feel and sound a lot better. And I think that, especially with bass bows, it varies widely the amount of hair. So you can't say there's exactly this measurement of hair that is good for every bass bow. I kind of look at the different qualities of each bass bow and the mortises that are in the holes that the hair goes in. And I see what would be appropriate for this bow, and I kind of judge based on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
More questions.
Sure.
Black hair, white hair, Siberian red horsehair. Is this all just the same and I'm just deluding myself, or are there real sonic or playing differences? What are your thoughts on different types of hair? What do you recommend or have recommended?
Well, I've heard a few different things about this, but I'll tell you my personal experience with the hair. And I'm actually planning on doing something soon where I do a little bit of a video series with the same bow, rehaired with different types of hair, same player, same bass, everything to compare it. So that's in the works, and I'll put that on my website. But in general, when I've played the different hairs, I feel like white hair tends to give maybe the brightest sound, whereas black hair on the other end of the spectrum tends to give more of a dark sound. And so if you have a particularly dark bass, maybe white hair would be more appropriate. Chestnut, I feel like a brown hair is more in the middle. That's very, very popular out here. And I feel like it's very similar to white hair. It just stretches a little bit less. So when you go to give a little bit more with the bow, it doesn't cave in as much, which is kind of nice. You can get a little more power. But I think there are definitely some differences. Some people think that it's just, it's not sorted as much, or there's things like that. And I think to each their own.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that's what I've found in my experience.
Another big topic is like rosin and using. I'll just tell a tiny story. I was playing Grant Park Symphony years ago in Chicago, and it was probably like 85, 90 degrees outside or something. And I had this way too soft rosin. I was just like a doofus. And I put this stuff on, and it just turned to glass. It like turned my bow hair into like this weird glass surface where I could like see the impact. And I could not, for the life of me, I had to go get a rehair. I like had ruined my hair. Like, had I really ruined my hair, was there any way I could have set? Because I tried everything. I tried rubbing alcohol in the hair. I tried combing it out.
Yeah.
I tried not rosining for a week. It's like I had permanently ruined my hair. And was there any hope for me? Does that happen a lot? Any thoughts on that?
That happens
topic?
quite often in Southern California, just because of our climate here. And, we tend to use pretty sticky rosin down here. I get a lot of people quite often that have maybe used just too much rosin, and it's just turned into one big hair, basically. And there is something that happens where when you apply too much rosin and you keep applying rosin, it has the opposite effect of what rosin is supposed to do. So it starts kind of repelling the string. And I have seen hair being cleaned on violin bows with that type of rosin, the more powdery rosin. I haven't had too much success with cleaning bass rosin off of bass hair. So sometimes if it's not too far gone, a lot of combing can sometimes help, but ultimately you might just need to get a rehair at that point if it's too far gone.
Okay, that's fascinating to me. Makes sense. How about, and something that one of my favorite people, David Allen Moore, talks about on bass playing is musical hygiene, just things you do every day to keep your playing in shape. How about bow hygiene? Between those, like we use our dentist analogy, you got your 6-month checkup and you get your rehair and maybe something else, the grip's coming apart a little. What should people be doing between those checkups, those rehairs, to just keep their bow in good working order, their hair in good working order? I'm thinking, like you mentioned, combing. Should you try to clean the bow hair? Should you be touching the bow hair? Should you not be touching? I mean, yeah, just general maintenance thoughts.
I think I'm of the. I kind of think you shouldn't really clean the bow hair much. I think cleaning the stick with a dry cloth is very nice. I do see a lot of bows that I clean every bow that I rehair, and there are a lot that are very, very dirty, but I don't judge. I mean, my bow is probably pretty dirty too. But yeah, I think some combing, loosening the hair is a really big one. I do see a lot of bows that people are not loosening after they're playing, and the stick tends to straighten out. It loses a lot of its curve or its camber. And so that's a really important thing. But I think just keeping it safe, clean, that sort of thing. And then when you come in for a rehair, hopefully the person will be cleaning it and making a note of any little issues that there are.
Do you like recambering bows? Like that's a thing. Again, I know very little about bows, but is that something that is common? Is that more like someone's left their bow hair too tight, or is it something that just naturally happens over the years? Is because I've never had. Maybe I should. I've never had any work like that done on any of my main bows.
Sure. Yeah, I think if you're not noticing any problems with the bow, I'd say leave it alone, because there's always a risk of breakage. There was a famous case of somebody in Southern California who broke a very, very expensive bow, and it was a whole big thing. And so cambering can be dangerous. It always comes with a risk, but most of the time it can be done pretty safely. And this would only be, if you have a spot in the bow that's a flat spot. There's not an even camber all the way through. It's losing some of its camber. So it is always at your own risk, but sometimes it can really revive a bow that has just kind of gone dead.
Yeah. There was a trend. I told you I had a whole bunch of random questions there. There was a trend in Chicago for a while, maybe nationwide, back in maybe the late 90s, early 2000s, of getting metal tips instead of the ivory or the bone tip, getting metal tips. It was like everyone was going in and getting those. And I got that on not my current bow, but and it sort of helped some things, but it also made it quite tip heavy. Yes. Is that a thing? Do you see that anymore? Was that just a weird fad from 15 years ago?
Well, I think at that time people were really concerned because there wasn't a great alternative for ivory. And so that was seeming like maybe that's a safe way to do that, but it does really change the balance and the weight of a bow. Now there are some alternatives, or one alternative that's pretty good called tip Armour. And I've been using that for a while. It's very, very hard material. It dulls my files like crazy, but I haven't seen it crack in the same way that I've seen other ivory replacements crack, and it has the same weight as ivory, so it won't change the balance of the bow.
Okay. I'm in a bass. I go into my local middle school once a week, and I work with these 6th, 7th, 8th grade, San Francisco kids, very cute, and they're playing, and their bow hairs inevitably, some of them break, and they look in horror, and they're like, Mr. Jason, what do I do? And what I was taught not to do is to just like directly rip them out. Like, what do you do when you break your bow hairs and they're hanging off the bow?
I personally carry a little nail clipper with me, and when a hair does break, I clip it at the end, so I'm not yanking anything out, and it just neatly, cleans everything up. So that might be a very easy solution, is just to carry a little nail clipper with you.
But yanking is not good, right? We shouldn't be just yanking our broken bow hairs out.
Yeah, that can loosen the knot that's tied at the end of the hair. So I wouldn't recommend too much yanking.
Okay. Maybe one or two more random questions.
Sure.
But I'm a French bow player primarily, and my middle finger kind of hangs on the bow hair a little bit down there, and it gets all like black and greasy. And I know I don't really play there, but it bothers me. Is there anything I can do to clean that up, or should I just like let it that's just life?
Well, the one thing that can be used to kind of clean that off, that's a very dangerous place to clean. Sometimes for violin bows, people will use acetone or denatured alcohol on the hair, but that's very dangerous, so close to the ferrule, because that could wick in through the hair and shrink the plug that's in there, or cause all kinds of problems. I did have one case of somebody who cleaned the hair with acetone. It wicked in and shrunk the wooden plug, and then the hair just popped out. And so it's dangerous to use those, and you might get it on the stick as well. So, I wouldn't even recommend being very careful. I would just say, just
Don't.
get regular rehairs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. No, that makes sense. Just wanted to know. I know a lot of bassists love to tinker, and so everybody's got all sorts of different weird methods. Bow screw. So I take the screw out, and I was taught like 20, 30 years ago to take and put a little bit of pencil graphite on there to help keep it from stripping the what is that part you call that you screw?
The eyelet.
The eyelet. Thank you.
Eyelet, yeah.
Is there any eyelet screw maintenance anyone should be doing, or that's going to get taken care of in your regular rehairs? And
it'll get taken care of in the regular rehair. The reason that an eyelet might strip is that, number one, brass is what the eyelet is made of, and it wears down faster than the metal that the screw is made of, whether it's stainless steel, sterling silver, whatever it might be. And there might also be an issue that you're not aware of, where one of the holes is drilled incorrectly, so it's wearing on the eyelet unevenly, and so that might be something that a bow maker or someone who works on bows can look at to maybe put the eyelet in straighter or re-drill one of the holes, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Wow. I probably, as soon as we get off the line, I'll probably have 30 more bow questions.
Sure.
Things I think about or am asked all the time or I see brought up. But this is cool. Well, I can't wait. I just before we talked, I talked with Danny Zimmerman, and we figured it out. And that was the 7th time he's been on the podcast.
Wow.
So I would love to chat again, and I love to see and there's so much we could explore. And you've already kind of given young bow makers some advice. And one thing we didn't talk about that could be kind of interesting is this summer was your first International Society of Bassists conference, right?
It was,
ISB conference. Yeah. What was that like for you? First time there?
It was fun. And I volunteered as well, worked as a volunteer at the convention. And that was interesting because I got to meet a lot of different people and, interact with a lot of the workshops that I might not have gone to otherwise. So that was very cool. And it was great. It was so much bass, but it was cool. And I had to go because it was at Indiana University. And I thought, I have to go back to Bloomington. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Brianna, bgbows.com is the website. Yes. and we'll link up to that and link up to your Facebook page. And if I'm down in Southern California, I'll let you know. And
sure.
It'd be great to meet up.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
Thank you, Brianna. So great to chat. And folks, check her out online at bgbows.com or Facebook and Instagram. That's all linked up on her website and in our show notes. I need to chat with more bow makers and bow repair people. I realized that Sue Lipkins episode, I went back and linked up to that, by the way. Check that out. That's a fun conversation. That was like episode 190 or something like that. So hundreds and hundreds of episodes later, finally another person working in the world of bows. Love what you do, Brianna. Very cool. And if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to hear more about, well, I guess not that much about bow makers, we'll try to do more on that, but about luthiers and about the people that play the bass and teach the bass, and you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so at contrabassconversations.com, subscribe, or any way or where you get your podcasts, we are there. And if you're new to podcasts, we also have an app, so you can get the podcast on your device through our app and just search for that in your app store. We also have a mailing list, so if you want to stay informed and learn about what's going on beyond the podcast in the bass world, head over to our website and you can sign up there and join the thousands of other people that are along on this crazy journey. So thank you, Brianna. Thank you for listening. And thank you to the team. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And Mitch makes beautiful basses in the Dallas area. He has a new location in downtown Kilgore, Texas. He's hosting concerts. What is he not doing? It's incredible. He's winning medals at the ISB convention. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper, who archives and catalogs everything we do here on the podcast. So valuable for all kinds of projects. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life at the low end of the spectrum.